Not for 1,000 years. Not since the Spartan legion had perished at the hot gates of Thermopylae had Western civilization been put to such a test or face such odds. Nor would it again face extinction, till in this century it devised the means of extinguishing all life. As our story opens at the beginning of the 5th century, no one could foresee the coming collapse. But to reasonable men in the second half of the century, surveying the situation of their time, the end was no longer in doubt. Their world was finished. One could do nothing but, like Ausonius, retire to one's villa, write poetry, and await the inevitable. It never occurred to them that the building blocks of their world would be saved by outlandish oddities from a land so marginal that the Romans had not bothered to conquer it, by men so strange they lived in little huts on rocky outcrops and shaved half their heads and tortured themselves with fasts and chills and nettle baths. As Kenneth Clark said, quote, looking back from the great civilizations of 12th century France or 17th century Rome, it is hard to believe that for quite a long time, almost 100 years, Western Christianity survived by clinging to places like Skellig Michael, a pinnacle of rock 18 miles from the Irish coast, rising 700 feet out of the sea, end quote. So writes Thomas Cahill about the strange moment when Rome fell and Western civilization hung in the balance. We may take it for granted today, but our literature, Christian culture, and heroes almost did not make it after the sack of the great empire. And yet, as Cahill points out, a strange people from Ireland, all too often disdained by their English neighbors and the rest of the world, would save the day for the West. As we tell the story of the Irish who saved civilization in this episode of the King's Hall podcast, we're reminded that small backwoods communities can play a pivotal role in securing a future for Christendom. It may be tempting to read our time with the darkest shade of black-pilled glasses, but it's helpful to remember that civilizations have collapsed and been rebuilt before. As we look around the political, cultural landscape of America, we see moral degradation, chaos everywhere, child sacrifice and genital mutilation, sexual debauchery, grotesque government taxation and overspending, and an elite political class that is feverishly committed to forever wars, lawfare against conservatives, and the promotion of the Frankensteinian trans movement. Our borders are open to the barbarian hordes from the Third World, and as a result, our daughters are being raped, murdered, and trafficked into oblivion. Our food and water supplies are contaminated with castrating chemicals, life and health spans are diminishing by the year, and the total state steals the value of our wealth through overspending, excessive taxation, and hyperinflation. Meanwhile, our sons are sent to die in the forever wars fomented by globalist elites and the military-industrial complex, wars that serve as little more than sophisticated money laundering schemes. All the while, our brothers and fathers in Appalachia are left to die because we're told there's no money to send for aid. Natural affections for people and places have been replaced by globalist calls to love everyone equally. What can men do against such reckless hate? How can we stop the onslaught by the leftist elites against Western civilization? How can we resist those who want to poison us against our fathers, rewrite our histories, rob us of generational wealth, and obliterate our culture through mass immigration and DEI education practices? Well, first, we should take heart. We aren't the first Christians in world history to have the deck stacked so radically against them. As our story about the Irish will prove, and as G.K. Chesterton once wrote, quote, on 5 occasions in history, the church has gone to the dogs, but on each occasion, it was the dogs that died, end quote. Dark and bleak as the future may seem, there is yet hope for the men of the West, if only we will find the courage to stand and fight. When all else fails, God seems to delight in using the most unlikely characters to preserve the light of Christian civilization. Could God do it again through unlikely places and peoples? The answer, it seems, has to be a resounding yes. As Rod Dreher pointed out in his book, The Benedict Option, small communities of Christians have been the real potential to preserve that which is being otherwise lost, abandoned, or attacked by the broader culture of death and decay. It is our hope that an episode like this inspires future communities of Christians to band together for the purpose of keeping the great culture and literature of Western civilization alive. But in Ogden, we've actually gone one step further. Not only are we trying to preserve our rich cultural heritage, but we're also willing to go on the offensive in the culture war. Christians must fight, one household, one church, one community at a time. As Winston Churchill once said, quote, "Nations that go down fighting rise again, but those that surrender tamely are finished," end quote. Wherever you live and whatever the outcome, you must decide whether you will surrender tamely. Here in Ogden, we choose to fight. Christendom, we're sure, will rise again. The Irish are a hot-blooded, mirthful people who yet understand the depths of sorrow and tragedy. They are, as author Jim Webb once described them, born fighting. It was this jovial fighting spirit that saved Christianity and the West from utter extinction. As we turn now to their history, it is our hope that it will inspire you and your people to build, fight, and win, no matter how strong the enemy seems, no matter how certain our doom or how small and unlikely we may seem. As we turn now to their story, it is our hope that it will inspire you and your people to build, fight, and win, no matter how strong the enemy seems, how certain our doom, or how small and unlikely it may seem that will affect real change. Galadriel once asked Gandalf why he put all his chips and trust in Bilbo Baggins, a rather small and insignificant hobbit. "Why the halfling?" she asked. To which Gandalf replied thoughtfully, "I don't know. Saruman believes that it is only great power that can hold evil in check. But that is not what I've found. I have found it is the small things, everyday deeds of ordinary folk that keeps the darkness at bay, simple acts of kindness and love. Why Bilbo Baggins? Perhaps it is because I am afraid, and he gives me courage." So may the Irish, small folk with ordinary ways, steal us with courage today. In the year 29 BC, Augustus Caesar commissioned a Roman poet named Virgil to write an epic poem. He wanted the poem to commend the themes of sensibility, hard work, and devout religion, all things that Rome needed to reclaim following its chaotic civil war. Virgil then spent the last decade of his life crafting, honing, and shaping what would become one of the greatest works of classic literature, a Latin masterpiece that would rank among the best of all masterpieces. In fact, the Aeneid would become one of the most important works of poetry in world history, maybe even the most important. The Aeneid would prove foundational and inspirational to nearly every great man in every age following, from Augustine to Napoleon Bonaparte to C.S. Lewis. Thomas Stearns Eliot, the great 20th century poet, called the Aeneid the classic of all Europe. It would indeed be safe to say that the world would have been vastly different without the publishing of this great work. Such an important work was cherished above all others, preserved from generation to generation. It was taught, read, and studied, and then passed down to children and grandchildren. It was, and arguably still is, a culture-defining work. And yet, like the whole of the Western canon, it was almost lost forever. There were three periods in Roman history. The first lasted from 625 BC to 510 BC and was known as the period of kings, when Rome was a monarchy. The second period was Rome's Republic era, which lasted from 510 BC to 31 BC. The final period, the Empire of Rome, lasted to 476 AD. The total Roman span of power lasted a staggering 1,480 years. For nearly 1,500 years, this all-powerful entity known as Rome dominated the world. The empire dictated culture with a classic learning style similar to, but also distinct from, that of the ancient Greeks. Roman literature, art, construction, and politics were a central force in shaping what Christian Europe would ultimately become. In many ways, Rome was Europe. The Romans punctuated their economic and civic domination with a ruthlessly effective and brilliantly efficient military. They conquered large domains with one of the greatest militaries in world history. They were, in essence, the greatest political entity ever to be. For all their greatness, the Romans were pagans, and rather godless ones at that. But then, a pivotal moment in world history. Christ came, died for the sins of the world, and arose. At first, directly after the Jews murdered Christ, it seemed as if Christianity had been stamped out. Nothing could happen now, or so it seemed, for their Messiah was dead. But in the wake of his resurrection, The apostles evangelized the world and the empire along with it. Slowly and surely, with careful and passionate preaching from the apostles, Christianity infiltrated every rung of society. But as it initially grew, so did its opponents. For centuries, Christians were persecuted and martyred for their beliefs. Then a Christian prince, Constantine, delivered the Christians from their agony and legalized Christianity in 313 with the Edict of Milan. Even more impressive, Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. The pagans had at last conformed. The greatest empire ever was now a Christian one. What would follow is rather impressive. Not only was Rome Christianized, Christianity, and Europe with it, was Romanized. Though the Roman Empire became an empire through military conquest, the inside of her borders were to a great extent peaceful. The late Thomas Cahill, the American scholar and author of How the Irish Saved Civilization, asserted that, quote, "The world has never known anything as deep, as lasting, or as extensive as Pax Romana, the peace and predictability of Roman civilization," end quote. There was virtually no crime, no instability, no insecurity. There was only peace. And yet, like most good things, the Roman peace was destined to die. After centuries of peace, the Romans began to take their tranquil environment for granted. As a result of centuries of unparalleled military success, the Romans grew overconfident. No one had ever beaten them, and indeed, no one ever would. As Bane once told Bruce Wayne, "Peace has cost you your strength. Victory has defeated you." You're welcome. The Roman Empire's arrogance was soon exploited by the roaming Germanic tribes from the north. Visigoths and Vandals came storming into Roman territory, intent on conquering it. Still, there was no cause for fear in the Romans. Quote, "The Gauls had been the first barbarian invaders hundreds of years before, and now Gaul lay at peace. The verses of its poets and the products of its vineyards were twin fountains of Roman inspiration. The Gauls had become more Roman than the Romans themselves. Why could not the same thing happen to these Vandals, Alans, and Sueves?" End quote. Contrary to their self-trust, the Romans were soon overrun by the fearless Visigoths, who sacked Rome in 410 AD. The sacking of the capital of Rome, the first outside attack on Rome in 800 years, marked the end of peace in Rome. It showed the vulnerability of the Romans and marked the end of an empire. Rome would decline for the next 60 years before the last Roman emperor would be deposed in 476. Rome would, in the end, lose everything. But what exactly would be lost with the death of Rome? Following the demise of Rome, Europe was plunged into chaos. Cahill is quick to point out that, quote, "A world in chaos is not a world in which books are copied and libraries are maintained. It's not a world where learned men have the leisure to become more learned. It's not a world for which the Grammaticus schedules regular classes of young scholars and knowledge is dutifully transmitted year by placid year," end quote. In short, Europe was in danger of losing her rich heritage of learning, which was at the heart of this powerful culture. The empire, formerly peaceful, had turned chaotic. The famously safe Roman roads were transformed into a den of robbers. The German barbarians were illiterate Aryans, and so they were at odds with both Orthodox Christianity and so-called book learning. Greek and Hebrew literature were safe in the East, but what was almost lost was all of Latin literature. By losing Latin literature, we would have lost the foundation on which the greatest civilization in world history was built. Cahill says that, quote, "We would have lost the taste and smell of the whole civilization. 12 centuries of lyric beauty, aching tragedy, intellectual inquiry, scholarship, sophistry, and love of wisdom, the acme of ancient civilized discourse, would all have gone down the drain of history," end quote. Not only were the Romans losing classical antiquity and civilization, they were losing confidence. Again, Cahill writes, quote, "What is really lost when a civilization wearies and grows small is confidence, a confidence built on the order and balance that leisure makes possible. As the art historian Kenneth Clark said, civilization requires a modicum of material prosperity, enough to provide a little leisure, but far more it requires confidence. Confidence in the society in which one lives, belief in its philosophy, belief in its laws, and confidence in one's own mental powers. vigor, energy, vitality. All the great civilizations or civilizing epochs have had a weight of energy behind them. People sometimes think that civilization consists in fine sensibilities and good conversations and all that. That can be among the agreeable results of civilization, but they are not what makes a civilization. And a society can have these amenities and yet be dead and rigid, end quote. Obviously, we didn't lose all Latin literature. It's still here, still inspiring, still epic, still making the biblicists mad. The Aeneid still inspires great men. Virgil's brilliant verses still burn on the pages, and his dazzlingly intricate Latin is still the pinnacle of classical antiquity. No, Latin culture wasn't lost. It was saved from the fire. But someone had to do the saving. So who saved it? Across the world from Rome, there is a tiny island where the people called the Irish dwell. The Irish are part of an ethnic group called the Celts. The Celtic ethnicity is not limited to Ireland, the island where the Irish live. They first became known to Western civilization in 600 BC when they ventured across the River Rhine and into Roman territory. Some of them settled in France and would later become the Gauls. Some traveled as far as Turkey and received a letter, as the Galatian Church, from Paul the Apostle. Others branched out to the island later known as England and became the Britons. In 350 BC, they reached Ireland. At present, Ireland is the only Celtic nation-state in the whole world. The Irish are the lone survivors of the Celtic heritage. What were they like as a culture? Thomas Cahill describes the Irish as an illiterate, aristocratic, semi-nomadic, Iron Age warrior culture, its wealth based on animal husbandry and slavery. They were a semi-nomadic cattle people, and due to their nature, the Irish changed very little. Some cultures usually only undergo change when it's brought by an outside influence and can go for long periods of time with little to no cultural oscillation. It seems that for centuries, Ireland did just that, remained relatively unchanged. As far as their history and literature goes, Irish character is abundantly clear throughout their ancient epics. It is especially clear in their epic Táin Bó Cúalnge, or the cattle raid of Cooley. Again, Cahill says that, quote, the first thing that will probably strike any modern reader who opens the Táin is what a rough, strange world this is, both simple and full of barbaric splendor. Here is no deliberation or subtlety, no refinement or ambiguity. We know immediately that we are at a far remove from Virgil, Cicero, Plato, and the whole literary tradition of the classical world, excepting perhaps Homer. The characters of the Táin do not think profoundly. They do not seem to think at all. But they do act, and with a characteristic panache and roundedness that easily convinces us of their humanity, end quote. In reading the Táin, we see the Irish to be confident and frank. They were very rough, very human. They were especially open sexually, apparently having no qualms about anything in that category. They were unabashed, very fiery, and jovial. Their people were lighthearted and free. The slave industry was also a big part of the Irish economy, ironically given that last sentence. The Celtic slavery field was incredibly effective, and a huge part of their financial prosperity came from it. The Irish were adept at kidnapping or man-stealing, which is a horrible sin. Little did they know that their deliverance would come from the same place as their condemnation. See, once upon a time, a very long time ago in Roman Britain, there was a boy. The boy's name was Patricius, or Patrick. Patrick lived with his father, Calpurnius, who was a deacon and local official. Patrick was hardy and well-fed and lived a typical, comfortable Roman life. But his situation changed rapidly when he was a young man. When Patrick was just 16, he was kidnapped by Irish raiders and ripped from his father's home. He was transported to Ireland, where he became the slave of a petty king named Miliach. Under Miliach, Patrick became a shepherd, a lonely and isolated profession. There was little human interaction, as Patrick often spent months at a time alone in the rolling hills of Ireland. He knew little of the Irish language at first, so any encounters that he did have with strangers while in the wilderness were particularly nerve-wracking and sometimes dangerous. During the 6 lonely years that Patrick spent as a shepherd, his only 2 companions were hunger and nakedness. He was exposed to the cold, and hunger gnawed in his belly. Abandoned by humanity, Patrick turned to the only thing he could, the God of his fathers. As a boy, he had never really cared for Christianity, and he had thought priests to be foolish. Now desperate, Patrick began to pray. Here's how he described how he made it through his captivity. Quote, "Tending flocks was my daily work, and I would pray constantly during the daylight hours. The love of God and fear of him surrounded me more and more, and faith grew and the spirit was roused, so that in one day I would say as many as 100 prayers, and after dark nearly as many again, even while I remained in the woods or on the mountain. I would wake and pray before daybreak, through snow, frost, and rain. Nor was there any sluggishness in me, because then the spirit within me was ardent." End quote. Finally, Patrick's prayers would be answered. He received a vision from the Lord in which a strange voice said to him, "Your hungers are rewarded. You're going home." The voice then told him that his ship was ready, even though Patrick was miles and miles inland. Dutifully, Patrick set out in search of this mysterious ship. His feet carried him he knew not whence, but eventually he arrived at the seaside port of Wexford. Patrick took it as a good sign that a runaway slave such as himself had made it through the entire country unmolested. In Wexford, he attempted to board a ship, but the sailors recognized him as a runaway slave and refused him passage. Scared that others would recognize him too, Patrick returned to his rented cabin and prayed to the Lord. Before he finished his prayer, one of the sailors knocked on his door and told Patrick that the crew changed their minds and had decided to take him with them. Finally, it seemed that Patrick would escape his island prison. It took 3 days to cross to the European continent, and once there, Patrick and his crew found only devastation. Patrick later described a desert through which he wandered for 2 full weeks. It's suspected that this was the year 407 AD, when the Germanic tribes had all but destroyed Gaul, leaving a veritable wasteland in their wake. Unable to find sustenance, the sailors turned on Patrick and taunted him by saying, "How about it, Christian? You say your God is all-powerful, so why can't you pray for us? We're starving to death, and there's little chance of our ever seeing a living soul." Uncowed, Patrick said, "From the bottom of your heart, turn trustingly to the Lord my God, for nothing is impossible with him, and today he will send you food for your journey until you are filled, for he has an abundance everywhere." Right on cue, a herd of pigs came stampeding over the hill. Patrick and the men took their fill of the pork. God had provided for Patrick again. After a few more years of wandering, he eventually made it back to his parents in Britain. Patrick was joyfully welcomed back, but something just wasn't right. He was too different. He'd become calloused and hardened as a result of his difficult lifestyle. He was too far behind in his education to keep up with the other young men his age. He'd had experiences that no ordinary Roman citizen could relate to. He was still isolated even in civilization. One night, Patrick had a vision. A man named Victoricus, whom Patrick had known in Ireland, visited him in his sleep. Victoricus handed Patrick countless letters which spelled out the term Vox Hibernicum, meaning the voice of the Irish. Immediately following that, Patrick saw a forest in Ireland crying out, "We beg you to come and walk among us once more." Upon waking, Patrick reported feeling stabbed in the heart. The visions increased, and Patrick became aware of his new mission. Christ affirmed that mission in a vision with the words, "He who gave his life for you, he it is who speaks within you." What was Patrick's mission specifically? He was going back to Ireland, this time with a mission. He was to be Saint Patrick, apostle to the Irish nation. In other words, he was to be the voice of the Irish. His mission now clear, Patrick departed from his parents' house. First, he went to Gaul, where he received a theological education at the island monastery at Literate. Because he had a complete lack of education up to that point, Patrick struggled mightily in his scholastic pursuits. But he persevered nonetheless and was soon made bishop, and, which is more, the first missionary bishop. What made Patrick unique was that he was one of the first, if not the first, to attempt to evangelize outside of the boundary lines of the Roman Empire. Even Paul had never strayed from the Roman borders. What Patrick was doing was entirely new and without precedent. There was real danger in his mission, but he expressed complete lack of fear in his writings. He was confident that God would deliver him. Patrick devoted the last 30 years of his life to evangelizing the Irish, or as he called them, his warrior children. It's worth noting that the period of change in the world during those 30 years has rarely been matched. Rome was falling into chaos, but the opposite was occurring in Ireland. Patrick was helping his people transition from chaos to peace. But how exactly did Patrick win over the Irish? Part of it was his personality. He was earthy and warm, and so he was above suspicion by the locals. He was also courageous, a trait that the Irish favored. Patrick was not scared of the Irish, which greatly increased their respect for him. But the other part has to do with the Irish consciousness itself. The Irish pantheon of gods was greatly disturbing, not comforting to the people. The Irish gods were fear-based. All of the ancient figures of Irish gods would give most people nightmares. Just like their gods, the entire Irish life was based on fear and violence, which was an unfulfilling and unsettling way of life. Ultimately, the Irish had a deep cultural fear of death. What Patrick offered the Irish was the satiation of their deepest fear, because as a Christian, there is no fear of death. There is no wondering about the afterlife. The entirety of the Irish people converted to Christianity in large part so easily because it satisfied this fear. And they saw in Patrick that a man could be both courageous and peaceful at the same time. Patrick transmuted the Irish virtues of loyalty, courage, and generosity into the Christian virtues of loyalty, courage, generosity, and peace. The Irish were perfectly primed to become Christians, and Patrick was the perfect messenger fitted by God to them. The Irish were also unique because they didn't completely eradicate the ethnic and cultural influences in their lives even after converting to Christianity. Christian virtues became preeminent, to be sure, but they retained the flavor of Irish culture. Here's where we find the typical understanding of Irish character, that of the jolly, sometimes tipsy Irishman. Cahill says that, quote, after Patrick, the eviler gods shrank in stature and became much less troublesome, became, in fact, comical gargoyles of medieval imagination, peering fearfully from undignified nooks, and the belief grew strong that the one thing the devil cannot bear is laughter, end quote. Even though the Irish civilization and lifestyle changed, having converted to Christianity, the Irish character did not change. Freud once muttered to himself that the Irish were the only people who cannot be helped by psychoanalysis. Throughout our exploration of St. Patrick and the Irish, the one thing it seems that the Irish did not particularly care for is scholarship. However, the Irish love of learning was coaxed into blossom by Patrick, a talent always there but in need of a nurturing father to bring it to fruition. Why did Patrick do this, an uneducated shepherd himself? For this reason, Patrick understood that although Christianity was not completely tied to Roman custom, it wouldn't survive without Roman literacy. So the first Irish Christians became the first Irish literates. It is a good lesson for us today to create, maintain, and cultivate the kind of culture that has the potency to change the world and endure great tribulation. The people must be educated. Literacy must be a central component of cultural creation and transmission. From this new love of learning sprang Irish monasticism. The difference between typical European monasticism and that employed by the Irish is that the Irish version did not seek the ivory tower of isolation. Instead, the Irish openly sought a community with which to worship God together. Cahill says that, quote, since Ireland had no cities, these monastic establishments grew rapidly into the first population centers, hubs of unprecedented prosperity and learning, end quote. The learning in these communities was extensive. The Irish turned out to be passionate scholars and learned about everything they could. Again, Cahill says this, quote, Irish generosity extended not only to a variety of people, but to a variety of ideas. As unconcerned about orthodoxy of thought as they were monastic unity, they brought into their libraries everything they could lay their hands on. They were resolved to shut out nothing. Not for them the scruples of St. Jerome, who feared he might burn in hell for reading Cicero. Once they learned to read the Gospels and the other books of the Holy Bible, the lives of the martyrs and ascetics and the sermons and commentaries of the fathers of the church, they began to devour all of the old Greek and Latin pagan literature that came their way as well. In their unrestrained Catholicity, they shocked conventional churchmen who had been trained to value Christian literature principally and give a wide berth to the dubious morality of the pagan classics, end quote. The Irish saw no need for self-imposed censorship, and indeed, they thought along the classic lines of, I am a human being, so nothing human is strange to me. It was precisely this lack of censorship that was about to give the Irish their unique role in history. The newly Christianized Irish, with their newfound fascination for learning, immersed themselves especially in the copying of manuscripts and books. They copied literature of every sort. The Irish tackled their new passion with characteristic levity and humor. Meticulous scribes copied books day and night, often leaving notes in the margins. After the death of Hector in the Iliad, one scribe wrote, quote, I'm greatly grieved at the above-mentioned death, end quote. Students also worked as scribes as part of their course load, and one student left this poem behind. All are keen to know who will sleep with blonde Aeneid. All Aeneid herself will own is that she will not sleep alone. Classic. During their Renaissance, the Irish also developed scripts that were an incredibly beautiful combination of Latin, Greek, and their own native languages. Though it is forgotten by many today, the reality was that the Irish became the saviors of Western civilization. As the Roman Empire and all of its literature came crashing down, the Irish were rising up. They sent missionaries to Europe who carried their books with them. Once more, Cahill says, quote, Latin literature would almost surely have been lost without the Irish, and illiterate Europe would hardly have developed its great national literatures without the examples of the Irish, the first vernacular literature to be written down. Beyond that, there would have perished in the West not only literacy, but all the habits of mind that encourage thought. And when Islam began its medieval expansion, it would have encountered scant resistance to its plans, just scattered tribes of animists ready for a new identity. Wherever they went, the Irish brought with them their books, many unseen in Europe for centuries and tied to their waists as signs of triumph, just as Irish heroes had once tied to their waist their enemies' heads. Wherever they went, they brought their love of learning and their skills in bookmaking. In the bays and valleys of their exile, they reestablished literacy and breathed life into the exhausted literary culture of Europe. And that is how the Irish saved civilization, end quote. They also played a pivotal, central role in converting the Carolingian dynasty to Christianity. St. Boniface, a British missionary who had been converted to Christianity by the Irish, crowned Charlemagne king of the Franks in 768 AD. Again, it was Boniface who chopped the trees of the pagans down in Europe. Although the Irish saved civilization, their history is still somewhat tragic. Throughout their history, they've been largely a heavily oppressed people group. The British, for example, continue to deal harshly with the Irish even to the present day. This attitude toward the Irish goes a long way back in history. The British have long disdained them because they weren't Roman stock. When the Vikings invaded Ireland, they crushed all the Irish monasteries, wiping out the scholastic hubs in Ireland. This cost the nation its leading role in Christian world politics. Later, Queen Elizabeth even contemplated genociding the Irish race altogether. The 18th century penal laws denied Catholics, and therefore Irish, the rights of citizens. This crushed the spirit of the Irish. All of their nobility fled the island, and as a result, nations like France inherited Ireland's best and brightest. The Great Hunger killed 1 million Irish citizens from 1845 to 1851, while another 1.5 million emigrated away from their homeland. For the most part, the British stood by and did little, if anything, to offer assistance. By 1914, the Irish population was reduced by a third, down to around 4 million. The anonymous poem Kilkesh epitomized the Irish suffering. What shall we do for timber? The last of the woods is down. Kilkesh in the house of its glory, and the belle of the house are gone. The spot where that lady waited, who shamed all women for grace, when earls came sailing to greet her, and mass was said in the place. My grief and my affliction your gates have taken away. Your avenue needs attention. Goats in the garden stray. The courtyards filled with water, and the great earls, where are they? The earls, the lady, the people, beaten into the clay. However appalling the anguish of the Irish, they knew it was coming. Somehow, this great ability to endure suffering had been ingrained in the soul of the Irish people. All of their literature, vernacular, and history is sad and tragic. The qualities they believed a true hero needed were a perfect example of Irish tragedy. Cahill says, quote, "What we can rely on are the comeliness and iron virtue of the Irish hero, his loyalty to cause and comrades, his bravery in the face of overwhelming odds, the gargantuan generosity with which he scatters his possessions and his person, and with which he spills his blood. Though this combination of virtues is epically noble, the culmination of their conclusions almost always leads back to tragedy." Daniel Patrick Moynihan summed up the Irish destiny when he said that to be Irish is to know that in the end, the world will break your heart. In the final telling, the Irish are a hardscrabble people who have suffered much and endured through tears and laughter. They fought in the face of certain defeat and somehow didn't lose their jovial spirit. Though they scarcely get the credit they deserve, it was the uneducated, rough around the edges Irish that saved Western civilization. Once Christian, they became literate. Once literate, they became saviors. And so, despite their tragic moments, it is to this proud race of warrior poet Christians that we owe our entire Western culture and way of life. The next time you read Virgil's Aeneid, thank God for the people that preserved it for you. And to return to a theme we touched on at the beginning of this episode, we have to ask, would the Lord be pleased to use unlikely Christian boroughs to preserve Western civilization once again? If we were to engage in such a preservation effort, what resources, talents, and energy would it take? Many see the writing on the wall. The left is actively seeking to destroy the West. Who will rise in the spirit of St. Patrick to keep alive this sacred cultural heritage? As Rudyard Kipling once wrote in his poem, If, so we are in the position to dream great dreams of a new Christendom and to go about rebuilding in the ruins with worn-out tools and lofty ambitions. The ashes of civilization smolder around us, but we nonetheless rise to the challenge of rebuilding. If you can dream and not make dreams your master, if you can think and not make thoughts your aim, if you can meet with triumph and disaster and treat those two impostors just the same, if you can bear to hear the truth you've spoken, twisted by knaves to make a trap for fools, or watch the things you gave your life to broken, and stoop and build them up with worn-out tools. And, which is more, you'll be a man, my son. The King's Hall podcast exists to make self-ruled men who rule well and win the world.
Well, gentlemen, welcome to this episode of the King's Hall podcast. We have two fine gentlemen. Dan Burkholder, not wearing flannel and not pulled from the fields of duck hunting.
No,
today.
I wasn't. Not today. Not today. But I do miss my flannel.
You do, but you look good.
Yeah, I would wear it every day. I mean,
welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you.
How are you doing,
for having me. Man, so good. I mean, what an insane week. Am I right?
It is. It's been an insane week.
So in the last week, like last 5 working days, I've probably had like one day where I could sit down at my computer. It's been insane.
Just running around.
How are you doing, Eric?
I'm doing great. And you know what? Speaking of great, Brian Sauvé.
Wow, I'm honored. Thank you.
Welcome to the show.
It's
that
good to
cold
be here.
open, I had moments of inspiration.
Yeah.
And I had moments where tears almost filled my eyes for the great, great Irish people.
Yeah.
By the way, Con, Scots-Irish.
I was going to say, these people sound familiar to me. Earthy, love killing, wear the heads of their enemies on their belts, reluctantly become Christians, learn how to read.
I love the one where it's like the Irish don't really think, they do.
Act.
I feel like, Dan, you know, your people actually kind of conquered the Irish and destroyed everything that was good, so...
Well, big news, guys. After several weeks of delays in editing, a week of weather delays where our whole shipment spent a week in Pocatello, Idaho. Haunted Cosmos, doing your duty in a world that's not just stuff, is here. Luckily, we had many pallets to unload, but we also had an enormous army of child labor with St. Brendan's Classical Christian Academy to unload the books for us. So that's how we keep our prices competitive here at New Christendom Press. We hope that you go pick up the book at newchristendompress.com/cosmos. And hey, Christmas shipping is going to be cut off. You got to order the book by December 11th.
Let's move the boxes.
Ben, I'm trying to do an ad read. I carried a lot of them. Run the film. I carried a lot of them, right? December 11th, okay? You got to do December 11th. That's going to be the cutoff to get this book in your hand by Christmas. Look at this. Gold foil stamp premium hardcover edition. Custom end sheets. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. Get your copy today.
I blame you. I think that's where this is going.
Superiors and inferiors.
Yes.
Look,
exactly.
nations rise and nations fall.
Nations rise, nations fall.
I think we can agree.
It is just such an interesting story, I think, that you had this people who almost no one, they're taken for granted. Like, salvation for Christian West isn't going to come from Ireland, and yet that seems to be exactly what happened.
The way that they're described in the Cold Open and by Cahill and others, it almost seems like they're kind of a tick on Western civilization.
Yeah.
Like they're there and they're an annoyance and really looked down upon.
Well, you can even think back to early America. You've seen the pictures of the signs where the immigrants would come over. This is actually, I think the first wave is when my family came over. A Scottish Presbyterian minister had come over, but there were signs all in New York that said Irish need not apply. Because even in America, they were sort of looked down on in this British Protestant project of America. Brian, I'm curious for you, is there a piece of this that is inspiring as you think about, again, our cultural moment can seem bleak, but something is helpful about reading histories like this and saying, well, this is not the first time that Western Civ has been on the ropes.
Yeah, no, that is so encouraging to see. Just legitimately, like what Chesterton said about 5 times the church has almost gone to the dogs, and each time it was the dogs that died. You just see that God does like to write this story in history, where he likes to take a small and insignificant sort of people or place or even individual persons like Patrick, a slave boy stolen from his homeland, and use them in these pivotal moments that you could never in the moment predict.
Right.
How they're going to shake out. You could never predict that, that Patrick guy is going to be, he's going to be pivotal, not only in the conversion of the Irish people, but then the subsequent salvation of Western civilization by the Christianized Irish. Those kinds of stories, they give you hope when the times are hard, but they also, there's such a call to, like the key theme of the Aeneid, the pietas, where Virgil aims to put in you this devotion to family and country and in your God, the gods, I mean, in the case of the Aeneid, but this pietas, that you would care more, not just about the individual hero like Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, where you have this individualized glory and heroes, but the Aeneid itself gives you this pietas, love for your people, love for your country, love for your God, what he could do. And it's your individual pursuit of mastery and love and virtue is set in the context of this greater story you're a part of. So I think it's so fitting that it would be someone like Patrick who really does end up embodying that virtue of pietas in going back to this people that literally enslaved him, to be their, humanly speaking, the one who brought salvation to their land. Mm-hmm. And then they would be the ones who save the Aeneid that embodies pietas in its story, in the Roman ethos. So it's just like all of these layers weave together in the story of the Irish and Patrick, and so many of them, they call us in a time where there is not love for family and nation and your God in our land, where there's a dearth of those things. It calls us to embody and aim to imitate a man like Patrick and give ourselves to that same sort of devotion in a time when, frankly, how could he have expected to succeed? He couldn't. We're in a time where it's like Gimli, small chance of success, what certain death? What are we waiting for? It's like,
yes,
that's where we find ourselves. And so you need stories like this, even if you do end up going to your death, even if you do go into obscurity, even if you fail, you need stories like this in your backbone to steel you for doing your duty in a chapter like this in the story God's writing.
Yeah, I think that's great. One of the other things I find so interesting, Cahill points this out, Dan, but the idea that Christianity transformed Roman culture, but also that Roman culture played a pivotal role in shaping Christianity. Even today, we have sort of these, on Twitter disputes or on X, where people will say, we don't need to read Aristotle or Virgil. But I was even thinking back to C.S. Lewis, who said, he listed the great works that influenced him that he would recommend to other people. I think he listed 5 books. 4 of them were like explicitly Christian. And then he said the 5th was probably his first, which was the Aeneid. So I just talk about why that literature is so important. Like, why as a Christian, even as a Christian pastor, we have a men's book group going on. And some people on the outside would say, well, why are you reading the Aeneid? Why is something like this so important? Why shouldn't Christians, push that to side and say, no, we have the Bible. We don't need that.
Yeah, one of the ways you could think through this, because obviously there's problems when you read pagan literature. There's going to be pitfalls, like Brian said, love of the gods in the Aeneid. But the thing is, if you look at the scope of world history, and you're going to emulate like just common grace, the wisdom of men, and the greatest civilizations that ever existed, why would you not pick one of the greatest, which is the Roman Empire, and look at what actually made it great? Because the thing is, just looking at the world, humanly speaking, with natural law, you have a culture that flourished for, what was it, like 1,480 years? Mm-hmm. I mean, obviously they had problems. In my church history class, I actually went through a lot of the history of Rome. There were obviously problems, but you had this unbelievable jump in human progress, in civilization. Even some of the things, just again, not looking at natural law and just assuming that part of our image bearingness of being image bearers of the Lord God is that part of what He instilled or created in us were certain common grace laws in which the Roman Empire truly embodied. Even things like they didn't practice polygamy. They were faithful in their marriages. I mean, as much as pagans can be, right? Amongst other things. But some of the greatest thinkers, philosophers that have ever lived were produced from that culture. And so I think it's a great testimony to the early church that they saw the wisdom in the Roman Empire and in the Roman way of thinking, and really used that as part of an organizing principle in which to really organize Christianity. I don't think it influenced the theology, but it definitely influenced some of the hierarchical practices, for good or bad. I mean, Roman Catholicism definitely has its pitfalls, but it really helped give it ground in which to grow.
Yeah, you could see that even with Patrick, where like God providentially chose somebody who would be well suited to minister to the Irish.
Yeah, and he was sent.
And he's working through all these, cultural, ethnic, racial groups to bring about salvation. It's also interesting, I think, that the Irish, they were converted under Patrick's teaching and his ministry. But Cahill's quick to point out they didn't like eradicate their ethnos.
No, they didn't eradicate it. And they also instilled some of the best parts of Roman culture, which was literacy and thought. And, I think that's absolutely a vital part. Because if you were to say, well, that's, you can't impose your culture on someone else, then would the Irish nation be what it was? It wouldn't be, because they would just be continuing to war, and there would constantly be this friction with peace and war. They wouldn't have the foundational ground of thinking and understanding the world that God made if they couldn't read.
Well, it's interesting too, Brian, because it's sort of an egalitarian way to view cultures.
Yeah.
Like we might say that all cultures are equal. We wouldn't say that, but people say that today. And then you look at stuff like this, and St. Patrick, and even the people who had been reared in Rome, there's a clear understanding that some cultures, particularly Western Christian culture, is superior to something like tribal pagan Irish culture.
Well, I think you can look at other cultures that have not been adopted, not adopted superior cultures, and what you get is syncretism. So you can see this even in Mexico with Roman Catholicism, and then there's strange supernatural tendencies. Or I was in Haiti for a while, and they mix Catholicism with voodoo, and so you get this weird syncretism.
Did you have to eat a cat?
No, I didn't have to. Well, I may have. I may have. I'd be ignorant. I'd be ignorant. I've also been to Asia, and so there's a good chance I've eaten felines there as well.
Definitely eat a lot of cats.
That's beside the point. That's not what I'm trying to say. But you could imagine, though, if there wasn't an adoption of Roman culture, of a superior culture, without eradicating the Irish culture. That's not what's happening. But adopting some of Roman culture, what if they hadn't done that? You would have most certainly produced some sort of syncretism with the Irish gods, and then with this superior god, right? Jehovah, and then they would have their other gods, but you didn't see that happen. You actually eradicated the old order of the gods. Cahill put that beautifully, in which their gods shrunk and pretty much were relegated to the corners, and where this joviality, laughter, made them hide in the shadows, and they were gone. It's not like a Haitian syncretistic sort of weird, bastardization of Christianity.
Well, it's also interesting reading the story of St. Patrick because, Brian, our Haunted Cosmos expert, is here. Some of the stories that are told, there is something in me that goes, oh, did that really happen?
Yes.
But when you think about those cultures and what was going on, I've read elsewhere that even with St. Patrick and like the Druid culture, you had to be like extremely learned. And so these were people that could take a culture like Christianity, be converted and be transformed by it. But then there was something that God was working through in the nature of those people to be able to pass on a cultural heritage too. And there's visions and there's all these things we say that's kind of strange to our hearing. But I'm just curious, like, how you read that story through your Haunted Cosmos lens.
Well, I mean, through my Haunted Cosmos lens, one of the big themes of that project is recognizing what happened both before and after Christ came with respect to the gods, or with the spiritual powers and principalities. Because sort of the materialist rewiring of Christianity tends to, whether tacitly or overtly, act like those gods were nothing, that they didn't really exist. They were mere superstitions. I mean, that people were sacrificing their children to nothing. They were just sacrificing their children because, hey, you can see how sort of this evolutionary line of thinking, like we've learned this pattern that to get something good, you have to sacrifice and give your strength. So what is the greatest strength that I have? Well, it's my children. What is the greatest of my children? It's my firstborn son. So what do I need to give to the gods in order to get blessing from them? The greatest blessing, the greatest of my strength. And so they develop this naturalistically reasoned supernatural practice of human sacrifice and a belief in a higher, like that. There's this idea these are all materialist superstitions. Against that, I would posit that both reason and the biblical record would teach us that instead the nations were given over to subjugation to spiritual powers. You see even an overt hint of this in an example like in the book of Daniel, where the prince of Persia resists this archangel of God for weeks, so he is hindered in bringing his message to Daniel. And the idea isn't that this is like the human king of Persia, but it's a spiritual, angelic type power behind the throne. And so my conviction is that the nations in the old covenant aeon and epic were governed by, or they were enslaved to varying degrees to false gods that were real. And so ancient myth and is mythohistory. It's a garbled and an errant account of real things. So real spiritual beings that really did subjugate and enslave people and demand their worship and teach them the arts of idolatry. And so but then when Christ came, one of the things that he was doing is he was retaking the dominion of man, seated by Adam to Satan, to the adversary, He was retaking that through his death, burial, and resurrection, such that a perfect glorified man, could rightly take dominion now over the earth again. So that now Satan is bound and the nations can no longer be deceived, Revelation 20, in the same way during this age of the world. So what we see post-Christ is the advent of Christ leads to the conquering, the binding of Satan and the plundering of his house, which is the world. So as Christians advance, first through the Roman Empire, the house of the Roman Empire, they kick out the old gods. Christ kicks them out, binds them. People now worship the true God. And then with Patrick, outside of the bounds of the Roman Empire, now they're going and they're conquering these lands of the false gods. And what I love, though, is that Christianity doesn't demand syncretism. It won't permit syncretism, where we just add Christ to the pantheon. But it also doesn't demand the total annihilation of a human culture and people into some now globalized, universalized, somehow ascended beyond the human Christian culture. That's like a generic Christian culture that now every land that becomes Christian is going to have this exact same language and folkways and customs. And instead of that, what we see is that Christ truly conquers their gods. And so they become funny gargoyles carved into the stones of churches to make fun of them. But we retain cultural celebrations, and they're now Christianized, and that's not syncretism. We're not adding Christ to the pantheon. Christ conquered that, whether it's a harvest festival or whatever it is, or the mythic history of a people. And you see this throughout the land. One of my favorite examples is the stave churches in Norway, where you go and you'll see these wooden stave churches that are built, and in art across them will be retellings of their myths, but Christian versions of them. So it didn't eradicate their Irishness or Nordicness or whatever it is. Christianity saved them as a people in a place that's shaped by this people and place and folkways and language and customs and food and all these different things. And it just suffuses back in the saving and the soul of those people such that they are no longer totally depraved, which doesn't mean they do the worst thing possible all the time. It just means that their nature was enslaved in every part of what it means to be human. It's now freed. And so you can see a reclaiming of their culture and a reestablishing of it. So that's a really, really long answer of the story of the world and how the Irish are an example of Christ's conquest over the false gods. But I think it's important because this is what we're participating in today.
Yeah, and I think it's also great because of the, just God's multifaceted glory in creating different peoples.
Yeah.
And you can see how Christianity transforms them, but it doesn't eradicate like Irish cultural flavor, something like this.
No. God intended for Christianity to adopt and be shaped by Romanization in its history, and for that Romanization and some of these Roman forms to actually then influence the way Christianity spread.
Yeah, and I think even with the conversation with like boroughs, we talk about Christian boroughs. Each one has unique flavors, right? If you go to Georgetown, Texas, it's a very different feel than, say, Ogden. We're brothers, but there's still distinctives culturally. Some of the, I think even just the vernacular that the people say in the basement in Ogden use is distinct and multifaceted and glorious, I might even say, Dan.
Rich.
It's rich. One of the things, Dan, I want to ask you, though, is as we think about, lessons we might learn from the Irish, one of the things that sort of inspires me to is saying, well, what if God would be pleased to build some of these boroughs and havens of Western civilization and literature today, somewhere like in Ogden, Utah, and we start to get into what would it take to do that sort of thing? First, though, I just want to ask you, do you see Ogden, you guys really were here before I was, starting a school, thinking through liturgy and worship and the right worship of a people from the ecclesiastical sphere. We're sort of getting into economics, hopefully one day the political as well. But do you see Ogden as playing sort of a preservation role in a similar sense to the Irish?
I would say in a similar sense, but not in the same sense, because one of the issues or one of the benefits of the Irish preservation of culture was in literature, right? That's what we just learned. And I think that there's a need for that, definitely, especially if maybe we get like a short break with the current political environment. But then at some point, Virgil will be erased. Like that will be the goal, is to erase a lot of the canon of Western history. We actually saw this few years ago. One of the motivations for starting New Christendom Press was actually the preservation of literature. But I think the greatest benefit, and different boroughs will have different skill sets and different emphases and different strengths. One of the things that has to be preserved here is actually a boots on the ground culture. It's not just literature, but it's actually a historic culture. And I say that as meaning, like, one of the things that people probably know about us is that we've reformed quite a lot. We've changed quite a lot from our Calvary Chapel days, from your standard Big Eva sort of flavor church to where we are now. And really the trajectory is not forward necessarily. It's actually backward. It's back to the old paths, the old ways. Even our emphasis on family and sexual piety and on the confession, patriarchy, things like that, and roles and responsibilities and all of that is actually a preservation of culture itself, Western culture itself, Christian culture, but in the West. And so I think that's one of the roles that all of these boroughs have a responsibility in bearing, is that we're actually keeping the old ways, like keeping the old paths, but not in a stodgy way to where it ends up being some Anabaptist, Amish, Mennonite sort of culture, but it's still an American culture. I'm an American. We're Utahns. Like there's certain emphases in a certain time that we live in that are going to naturally be who we are. Like we're going to have the errors of our time, and we're going to have the strengths of our time and the competencies and the shortcomings and all that. But one of the things that we have to place a focus on is not forgetting the old ways, not neglecting the old paths to where they become so grown over with briars and brambles that they're forgotten. And a lot of that is just confessionalism. Is the teaching of our fathers and the honoring of our fathers, and not removing or moving the landmarks of our fathers.
Yeah, I think it's also interesting because when you look at like the monasteries, we talked a lot about the literature, but a lot that they were doing too was forming towns where towns didn't exist. Mm-hmm. It was a place for people to gather, but the monks were also teaching things like farming practices. They're teaching like, metallurgy and trades. So it was also like, it goes beyond just, Greco-Roman literature. Yeah. It's also like trade, economic, and that's why you get these, this idea, even in the West, of like churches at the center of a town or a city or something like this. Brian, just curious your thoughts on Ogden, some of the stuff that we've done here. Did that influence, like this sort of ideal, did it also influence like why a school?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and wow, I have a lot of thoughts. Sometimes I have a lot of thoughts, Eric, and they're like yelling. One of the to the ressourcement question, and then to the school and on the ground culture question. I think it's important to find that when you set about the work of reform and ressourcement, going back to the older paths, and you some of the work that you often end up doing is clearing away modern accretions, or clearing away or going back on a path and finding that you took a wrong turn. And so one of the purposes of preservation of these works and of thought from something like, even take the 16th century, 17th century work of Protestant theology and things like that, and the Protestant theological ressourcement movement that we've seen in the last 20 years and continues today. One of the things that it does is it challenges your modern suppositions, and it will often demonstrate that some part of your thinking and practice is actually fairly modern. Sometimes even things that you thought were very old turn out to be actually from the 1960s or the 1980s, or something like that, and that you actually thought that those things were classically reformed ideas. So it's a dangerous work, ressourcement, because it can end up turning you back and finding that, wow, we're aliens. Like the way we think is alien. This is why, not to beat a dead horse, but this is why the post-war consensus conversation can be so challenging, is because a lot of the time what we find in post-war thinking or in modern thinking, even if you don't like post-war consensus, just stick with me. Like, you call this post-enlightenment thinking too, and I think that's true as well, but especially in a concentrated way, post-World War II, 1960s onward, that kind of thing. you find that things that we thought were very old or automatically correct ways of thinking are not how our fathers thought at all. And then when you start going back, you have this dangerous moment where you go, am I going to think and talk and speak like they did, or am I not? And it doesn't mean that every thought that's older is automatically correct or anything like that, or that you can critique and grow. And I think the church grows in knowledge, and there's possibility of real progress. We're Christians, so we can progress towards an ideal, towards a heavenly ideal, even a heavenly ideal that shapes our earthly life. That's true. And that means we can really critique aspects of former belief, thought, and culture. But preserving these things and even seeking to understand them properly and not in a shallow way can challenge and help us at the same time.
Well, I think if you kind of put what you guys are saying together, like you're challenged by these ideas, but to Dan's point as well, the rubber really hits the road. And I think where a lot of the conflict comes is when you start implementing them, right? It's one thing to, let's say, talk about head coverings and to realize, wow, this is really like part of the feminist movement that the church has stopped doing this, mail in your head covering. But when you actually start living that out in culture and community, even if, like here, it's not like we're mandating it, we allow for the practice. But even seeing 20% of the people, the ladies with head coverings on Sunday, people will automatically walk in and think, what kind of weird place is this?
Totally.
And that will create theological controversies and, friction at multiple points. I think you could say the same thing, honestly, about Christian nationalism.
Nations and political
I grew up reading right-wing political stuff, but of the normie con, right? Like Sean Hannity and stuff like this. And so it was kind of the idea that, religion and the government should be separated. You should have a secular state. But this was condoned in Christian circles. So then when I'm reading like Calvin in the Institutes on what a magistrate is for, you're like, this is completely alien to everything that I've thought. Well, that's fine if you have that as a thought experiment. But what happens when you start advocating for these policies in the political sphere? Dan, you actually run into real issues, don't you?
Yeah, it is. It's also, it really shakes you when you start treading these old paths, and then you look behind you and you're like, wait a minute, there's a fork in the road there. Or this was the older path or whatever, like you said with Calvin and the magistrates. And then you start speaking that way and thinking that way. And you meet a lot of resistance. It's very uncomfortable for people. And so it's funny because we have two different ministries, if you will. So we have our church ministry, our local ministry, and then what we're doing right now, which is a more public ministry. And so what people don't see is the speed in which we actually change locally. And this is just an outflow. So a lot of what probably seems shock jockey or novel or whatever to a lot of people in our more public ministry is work that we've been doing on the ground for years here locally.
And didn't just change your mind overnight and then go, hey, everybody, this is what we do now.
Yeah, absolutely. And so people probably don't realize that those changes that we've made are really well thought through. Hopefully most of them, sure, we made errors and whatever, but most of the changes that we've made have been really well thought through. We've reasoned with one another and spoken with godly men and have gone to original sources in order to really become convinced of these changes. And then you hear about it for the first time, the person in Tennessee, Texas, Alabama, Washington State, whatever, from us. And you're like, oh man, that's shock jockey, or that's novel, or I that's crazy that you'd think that way.
This patriarchy thing.
Yeah. Not realizing that this is, wait, we did the reading. We've been thinking about this for years and we've actually implemented it here. And this is the fruit that it's producing. It's just a really interesting dynamic.
I recently told someone, they were thinking through some huge theological change. And I was like, I took longer to go to adopt paedobaptism than you've been a Christian. Right? It's like sometimes that could get lost. I do have a thought about education on this front as well as it relates to our practice and sort of this, like the danger of ressourcement, the danger of preserving the history of the West and the thought of Christian culture and Western culture and things like that. One of them is in the world of education, where from the beginning, our school's been somewhat weird in how we've structured it in the forms with, not just like discrete grades 1 through 12, but instead having 4 forms of multi-year groups that learn together. And then even as we go, like there's a never-ending thinking and going back and looking at the past and saying, how did education happen? And you find that in the past, in the monastic system's a good example of this, is that learning and education was largely a matter of the clergy and the nobility in history. Classical education, and then what became classical Christian education, the history of that really until the Protestant Reformation and onward, and then even into the Protestant Reformation, generally the people who were educated were the clergy and the nobility, and they would receive a particular type of education in rhetoric. Cahill mentions a grammaticus in that Irish section. A grammaticus is like a teacher who would teach a student when they were young before they would go to a rhetor, who would then take them through their later education and become trained in rhetoric and classical learning. And then nobility and clergy would have different sorts of inputs educationally. And so you look at that, and there's a good element in which Protestantism introduced through the priesthood of all believers the idea of universal education, that all men should have a certain baseline of education and literacy, and that's a good thing. I agree with that. But then what we've done, particularly in the last 110 years or so, from World War I on, especially accelerated after the Great Depression, is we've really intensified universal education to the point where people are now cutting folks off from, this also has to do with the Industrial Revolution, cutting people off from family trade and family business, putting them through this universal ideal of education that takes them at first through about 12 to 14, and then it gets older and older. Then it was 18 with high school. And functionally now it's more like 22, where most people are expected to go get an undergraduate degree in general studies, basically, before they master in something particular and maybe even pursue a doctoral degree or something like that. But when you go back and you start doing this dangerous work of ressourcement, you actually start to realize that, oops, we're not paying attention to the world God made or the reason people educated the way they did. Now, there were resource problems. You needed a superabundance in culture in terms of money and food and with leisure time to afford to send all of your people for 22 years of education. You have to be exceedingly wealthy. So that wasn't possible until some of the extremes of wealth today in the modern West and in America and things like that.
Well, especially when the economy went from the home to outside the home.
To global. But one thing you do start to notice, and we've noticed it, and we talk about it a lot, and we look to the future of our communities. We have many young children, hundreds of children under the age of 12 in our community, literally gathered on Sunday, even if you just reduced it to that. We're looking, how can we critique our modern ideas of the household, of education, of trade, of business, of family, of things like that. And one of the elements that you have to go back to and critique, and I think change and become alien to the modern world, is to reclaim this idea that there is such thing as an elite class of nobility and clergy that ought to be educated in a certain way, the fullness of a classical education, but that a lot of people don't actually need, nor will they be benefited from spending through age 22 studying these things. And instead, they need to be given a baseline, that priesthood of all believers, level of classical education in reading and giving them the tools of learning and access to the great works of the West and how to think well and read well and write well and speak well, those sorts of things. But many of them are actually, they were gifted by God to go and be tradesmen or to be homemakers or to be entrepreneurs or things like that won't be super benefited from the education of clergy and nobility all the way through that extreme edge, that right edge. That might be 10%, 5%, 3%. And so I give this as an example of a way where we're thinking in Ogden of like, how can we really put our money where our mouth is, looking back at these cultures that have preserved greatness from the West, but also then to let those riches critique our modern presuppositions that are hardwired into us, and maybe even do the shocking thing of operating differently, of rejecting the modern, and sometimes even painfully rejecting the near modern, the 20th century innovation theologically and the theological apparatus that came post hoc to justify the post-war consensus thinking, and to say instead, we're going to go back. We're going to look like aliens to a lot of people, in how we talk and think and build and employ our children and educate them and all this stuff. But we believe it's going to be more fruitful. Someone's going to hear this whole rant and they're going to sum it up by saying Brian doesn't believe in educating children or something like that. But because that's the state of our discourse.
Actually not true. One of the things that happens, like you said, when you tread the old paths and you read history, is that you look around and you're like, wait a minute, they did what? And the fruit of what we're doing is better. Like it's not better. It's worse. So what did they do? And you start going back to the old paths, and the school is really a cultural formation, factory, if you will. Mm-hmm. That's a word that people in the education movement hate, but it's really produces a particular culture. Getting back to the Irish though, with the monasteries, being like the center of human flourishing and culture and towns and cities and everything like that. This has been one thing that I've noticed we've been moving more into, but it hasn't been as much intentional as a consequence.
Organic.
Yeah, exactly. An organic thing that we've been doing is that with the monasteries, they weren't in ecclesiology. Like they weren't in every single sphere. So when the priests are teaching metallurgy, they're not like the foreman over all the metallurgists, union or whatever. They were instructors in forming a certain class of people and educating them, but they weren't in charge of everything. And so what ended up happening, I think, in Ireland was that you had these monasteries that were essentially cultural centers. They were cultural centers for which education and economic and political activities all would surround themselves by. And that's kind of what's been happening here in Ogden, is that the pastors aren't in charge of every single thing. Like you can't do a business unless you have the blessing of the pastors or something like that. But naturally, business relationships and connections occur here in the cultural center because you have culturally similar people with similar values worshiping the same God, and so that naturally happens. And same with education and with just all relationships and politics and everything like that, is that the borough ends up being the cultural center for an entire people, which is really what happened in Ireland.
Yeah, it is. It's also interesting because you have St. Patrick, obviously the Irish are transformed. The next episodes that we'll get into are on Charlemagne. And you say, well, what's the connection? Well, sometime later, centuries later, you've got Boniface, who will become a missionary back to Europe. And they will take everything that they've learned and they'll go back to Europe, mainland Europe, to like re-catechize the continent. And one of the people that is most influenced is Charlemagne. And it's because of men like Boniface, who's bold and courageous. And yes, we know him for chopping down Donner's Oak. That's been, kind of a well-told story in our circles. But the other thing that is often missed is that he spent a great deal of time reforming the clergy. Mm-hmm. So you had gross sexual immorality going on, and because of that, infanticide, hiding the sin that these priests had committed. So Boniface goes around like purifying the clergy, being courageous, not just attacking the pagan idols, but also addressing the problems within the church. And Charlemagne gets wind of this. These stories inspire him. And so he says, we want to bring people from Ireland to re-educate our nobility, to train our kings to be in our courts. And again, to Dan's point, they weren't in charge of the kingdom,
right?
But they had a vast role. And one of the lessons I think that we can take from it is that element of the warrior poet, the courageous pastor. When you look at the compromise going on in the American church, it's hard to fathom why any king would value your input on civil matters, right? Because you haven't been courageous. And vice versa, if you're able to culture build, again, to Dan's point, we've seen this in Ogden. You can kind of plant a business anywhere in America right now, but where can you go where you have like a based community that's going to support you? And where pastors are going to have your back, right? We have all this kerfuffle in the reform circle. And I think at the heart of a lot of what's going on is actually that there are pastors willing to betray congregants for laughing at the wrong things, right? So there's this great distrust right now, I think, within the American church. And one of the things that you can do if you're a pastor, first and foremost, is be courageous And then you have opportunities to influence other men who will be attracted to that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Courage. No, courage, hope, positive vision. But these things also, I like that in the Irish story, there's a very realistic tinge of sadness and melancholy, and they recognize the hardship. Like they have a joviality has a hard edge to their joviality because
it's not naive.
Tested. No, it's not a naive sort of thing, and they've been a very hard pressed people in a hardscrabble land, that kind of thing. And I think that shapes you as well. It is funny. Like I don't want to just be like, oh, we're exactly like them. But Ogden, like being a Christian church in Utah, there's a certain cultural it's a fusion that happens because of that. It can be for ill or for good. And we've seen both ministering on the ground here in Utah. But one thing it does do is it gives you the sense of you're not the dominant culture. So you have to figure out how to, and there's not many of you. So you have to figure out how to work together with people who are not exactly like you Christianly. And don't, like just this week, one of our deacons, we sent him down and talked to a local minister that we'd been hearing some things like, hey, that church is a cult, or, those people at Refuge are really weird. And so we didn't blast him. We sent a guy down and said, hey, go have lunch with him, talk to him, and build a bridge. And that's our instinct. We send it, and it works. Like they go to, hey, ask us anything you want for a couple hours. Great, cool. And that's very helpful. But the other thing it does is it makes you realize that Christianity really is a religion of world conquest, and that you're constantly faced with the task of bringing conquest, the conquest of the kingdom, to a place that hasn't tasted it yet. And it just shapes you in terms of your culture to where there's not an ease, there's not abundance. You have to build anything if you want it to exist. You can't just go and like, oh, look at all this Christian infrastructure that's been built for hundreds of years. It doesn't exist.
You can't expect it's going to be easy either.
It's going to be really, really hard. Expect it like people call Utah the church planting graveyard, because people come and they have really good intentions, and they think, I'm going to plant a church. I'm going to use this playbook from whatever church planting growth network, blah, blah, blah. That's really built, let's be honest, on transfer growth, a lot of these. Going and starting a new franchise that wins people from existing churches. So how a lot of church planting works. And that simply doesn't work in Utah because there is no transfer growth to be had. It's a colonizing missionary sort of endeavor. And that's a hardship, but it's also a gift because it does teach you to build. It teaches you, and since you're building everything from the ground up, it teaches you how to do that, which requires you to look backward and go, how did people used to do this? And it also makes you critique some of the modern things that only work in cultural Christian areas. You can't just use those. So you have to say, like, how did Patrick build? How did this work in the early Roman Empire? How did this work? And that creates a certain edge and a camaraderie in the church, a unity, a oneness, and a depth, I think, a strength there that is... It's a tested sort of thing.
Yeah. I also think when you look at the kinds of people that have moved from elsewhere to be a part of the culture here, there's something about it being hard that is good because it requires a certain kind of guy. And you've really got to be, there's a level of competence and courage that's required, but it's also attractional. Like when you find other competent, courageous people, you say, great, I want to be a part of that. And it can thrive that way. Brian, one of the things I want to do just as we close down is give people, I guess, some plugs. We've got a very exciting book that's been on pre-order.
Yeah, and when is this coming out?
But it is supposed to be, we are supposed to be shipping books to us tomorrow as of this recording.
Yeah, the first shipment from our printer of Haunted Cosmos, Doing Your Duty in a World That's Not Just Stuff, it goes in the mail tomorrow. So it should be to us like early next week as we record this, so by the time you're hearing this, long story short, we'll be shipping books. We'll have that book out of pre-order and into just normal ordering. So newchristendompress.com/cosmos, COSMOS, and you can find the book there or just in our store if you forget that. It's there.
But definitely order So you have time for Christmas.
Yeah, the cutoff that we're saying, I'm pretty sure for getting there by Christmas is December 10th. So make sure you just, if you want a copy for Christmas or a couple to give out as gifts, pick it up. It's a historic book. It's the first internal New Christendom Press book written by one of the founders. Like written by one of us. And Ben and I both wrote about half each of the book. It's not a recapitulation of previously published material or Haunted Cosmos episodes. It's a serious look at the world that God made, the seen and the unseen, and doing your duty in that world. And so I hope that it's a book that causes people to marvel in the Lord, to look at the world, the seen and the unseen, and marvel in the Lord, and then also be challenged to live boldly as Christians in this world as well, curious and know how to approach these things. So yeah, check it out.
It's going to be great. Hardcover. Nice.
Yeah, premium hardcover. It's really cool. Gold foil stamping design, like classics, custom slipcover, that whole, or whatever it's called, dust jacket, not slipcover. And yeah, man, I'm really excited to finally hold it.
Yes,
here in a couple days.
I'm as well. Yeah. The other thing that I just plug, we've got conference for next year.
Yes.
So be on the lookout for that. We're going to have more promotional material coming out. But if you want to build, I think coming to the conference, connecting with other guys. Dan, one of the big things I think for the conference is actually like the economic and political networking that can be done with other business guys. We'll have a great number of booths. A lot of our sponsors will be there with booths. We've got a lot of guys going to the business VIP mixer stuff. Yeah. So there's going to be a lot of that to interface with people.
Pastor's lunch?
Pastor's breakfast.
We're going to have a free pastor's breakfast, right? Isn't it free? Like we're covering the cost?
Yep.
Is that right?
That's right. So if you're a pastor we'll have breakfast at the church. Want to connect with you as well on the ecclesiastical. It's a really good time to do that. The other thing that I have just got to plug is we just went to a wedding. We were invited to a wedding.
Yes.
Brian played at the wedding. And this was people who had met at the singles mixer at last year's conference.
Last June.
So they met in June. Wedding that was November.
Yep.
So
or October, or no, it was November. You're right.
Yeah, early November.
Yeah.
So Dan, what I'm saying is there's a chance. Like if you're single and you're listening to this show and you come to the singles mixer, you've got a chance.
No, I think you have a very good chance. No, think about the opportunity though. So amongst like all of the opportunities to build that we're offering, not only is this
build a household.
not only is this a huge white pill, but it's not just ethereal fluff that you're going to receive. It's actually a call to build, and then the tools of companionship. I just read this morning from Ecclesiastes to the students in chapel about the threefold cord is not easily broken, and gave the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, how they were able to stand in courage in the face of certain death. And in our culture of death, in a time where it's very hard to build, what better opportunity do you have to find like-minded men and women in which to build churches, businesses, and households? Yep. Like this is a great opportunity.
If you're a business owner as well, and you'd like to host a booth, we moved our venue because of the size, how many people we're going to have coming, Lord willing. So it's going to be a great time to be a business owner. Reach out to us if you'd like to host a booth. It's one of the lowest cost conferences I'm aware of in terms of showing up and bringing your booth and advertising your business. So real low entry point. If you just want to have a booth, come get in touch with us. VIP business mixer, and we'll have a VIP mixer and a business networking event that are both different things this year.
Yep.
So that if you're like business only, you want to really network with other high cap business guys, come to that one.
If you want to meet the speakers,
that sort of thing, hang out with guys. And guys, we don't invite speakers that are like the biggest platforms on earth. Who do you think could just move tickets with Big Eva or Big Evangelical Normie World? We try to bring guys in that these are our guys that we believe in, that we've fought with, that are our men that we are shoulder to shoulder with. And
so we got Trump.
So we got Trump. Don't lie to the people.
I'm asking a question.
This will be, I think it's through about Christmas that we'll have our best pricing on the conference ticket as well. Yeah. But it's super accessible to the whole family. Like there's like low cost teenage tickets, and kids are free below a certain age. So just come hang out with us. It's going to be a great conference. The last two have been so much fun.
Yeah, I think last year
so encouraging.
Over 1,000.
We had like 1,000 people last year.
We had a big church picnic on Sunday, church service. You stay for church service.
Come and just vibe with us, guys. It's going to be so fun.
Yeah, fantastic. So, check that out, newchristianpress.com. We'll have more information on the
conference tab up at the top of the page. You can check that out.
That's right. Dan, I want you to give a charge, but I want you to do it with an Irish accent. No, I'm just kidding.
Eric, I'll beat you with me, shillelagh.
Yeah, please don't.
I think we've had enough of bad accents in this episode. Bane. I mean, can we just have a moment of silence for that?
My Bane was.
There was no Asian accents, though.
Oh, Eric, you have hurt my feeling. The kamikaze.
I should just know at this point that I have to write a charge for every one of these episodes because I'm not doing them ad hoc.
They're better off the cuff. This is.
Yeah. So in this time, when we face what looks like overwhelming odds, what I would ask is that you call back to our ancestors, to our fathers, the great men that have come before us, and remember the stories that God loves to tell. Because if you were to write the story of St. Patrick yourself as a fictional tale, nobody would believe it. Nobody would find that compelling. And yet God took this man who was a slave shepherd boy, and he used it to save the entirety of the West. And so remember that you should put yourself in the way of blessing, that you should surround yourself with good men and with righteousness, and be quick to repent, so that God doesn't have any excuse to do anything but to bless you. And if in the face of overwhelming odds, you never know what the Lord may do through you. So, Festinolente, make haste slowly. Until next time, the King's Hall.